The mother wolf lay in the crater, her breath ragged, silvered fur matted with blackened blood. Smoke curled from the wreckage of the Xyrixian drop pod behind her, its shattered hull still humming with residual energy from a failed descent. Her pupils flicked upward, twin shards of molten gold, watching the night sky as if searching for something, waiting. But nothing came. Her cubs whimpered, tiny, squirming bodies pressing into her, as if they could stave off the cold creeping into their mother's bones. The largest of the three, already bearing the sharp angles of a future predator, nudged at her muzzle, confused. She did not respond. The rise and fall of her chest slowed, deliberate, controlled. The instinct was there: survive, protect, kill. But the reality was undeniable. She would not last a night. Elias Kade stood at the lip of the crater, rifle raised, scanning the wreckage below. His breath fog in the chill air, his stance loose but measured. The battlefield had long gone silent, save for the distant crackle of dying fires and the sporadic pops of cooling metal. He had come here expecting salvage, maybe a few scraps of Xyrixian tech to trade, but what he found instead gave him pause. The creature's eyes locked onto his. Even dying, even knowing its fate, it did not look away. It did not beg. Kade had seen that look before. A soldier's look. He exhaled sharply through his nose, shifting his grip on the rifle. The Xyrixians were a warfaring species, but they did not discard their weapons lightly. If they had left this predator here, there was a reason. The cubs, too small to be a threat now, but something in their genetic design must have made them more trouble than they were worth. And now, they were defenseless. One pull of the trigger would be mercy. The mother wolf growled, a low, rattling sound that sent a sharp thrill through the air. The cubs startled, but did not flee. The smallest one, dark-furred with piercing silver eyes, stumbled forward, ears flattened. Kade tensed as it wobbled toward him, sniffing. Stupid thing didn't even know what he was. A final act of defiance, or trust. Kade wasn't sure which twisted his gut more. A tremor rolled through the ground, and in the distance, a plume of dust signaled movement. Something large, something scanning. The Xyrixians weren't done with this planet yet. He was out in the open, a scavenger caught between decision and instinct. The smart move was to walk away. He lowered his rifle. The mother wolf exhaled once, something easing in her stance. She nosed the cubs forward, her last command clear, even as the light faded from her eyes. Kade cursed under his breath. He wasn't built for this. He wasn't a hero, wasn't some martyr with a bleeding heart. He'd seen too much, lost too much, to pretend otherwise. But damn if he could turn his back on a creature that had just made a choice no different than the one he'd made 1,000 times before on a battlefield. The second her body stilled, the wind carried away the last of her warmth. The cubs hesitated, then pressed into each other, instinctively seeking comfort in a world that had suddenly become far less forgiving. Kade adjusted the strap on his rifle, scanning the horizon. If he left them, the elements would take them before the scavengers did. And if they didn't, the Xyrixians would. And yet, the moment he reached down, the moment he scooped the smallest one into his arms, he knew there was no turning back. They would come for him, for all of them, and he'd be damned if he let that happen. The wind howled across the barren wasteland, kicking up sheets of dust that clung to Elias Kade's skin like a second layer. The cubs huddled close, their small bodies trembling against his armored vest as he moved through the skeletal remains of what had once been a battlefield. Towering wrecks of Xyrixian war machines loomed like the corpses of gods, their twisted metal hulls frozen in their final moments of destruction. Some still crackled with residual energy, their alien circuitry pulsing faintly in the dark. He kept low, cradling the smallest cub against his chest while the others trotted in his shadow, their tiny paws silent against the cracked ground. His rifle was slung across his back, but his sidearm was drawn, finger light on the trigger. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. The mother wolf had been left for dead, but he knew better than to think she had been the only one. The Xyrixians didn't waste resources. They abandoned what they feared. And if they feared these creatures, then someone, somewhere, would be coming back to ensure their extinction. He didn't have to wait long. A flicker of movement, a glint against the night sky. Kade tensed, instincts flaring. The cub in his arms stiffened as well, silver eyes locked onto the dark horizon. Its littermates followed suit, ears twitching. They sensed it. A second later, his visor's HUD picked up the incoming heat signature. Small, fast-moving, tracking low. A drone. Kade didn't hesitate. He dropped, rolling into cover behind a half-buried piece of starship plating, flattening himself against its jagged surface. The cubs followed suit without command, pressing against the metal, their tiny bodies vibrating with tension. Smart. Too smart. The drone passed overhead, a silent hunter, scanning with beams of ultraviolet light. Kade held his breath. The smallest cub tilted its head, ears angling toward the machine, as if listening to something beneath the audible range. Then, without warning, it let out a sound. Not a whimper, not a growl, but something else. A distortion rippled through the air. The drone faltered. For a brief second, its flight stuttered. Its scanners flickered, its trajectory dipping. Kade seized the opportunity. He drew his sidearm and fired. The silenced round cut through the air, striking the drone's core processor. Sparks burst like fireflies as the machine spiraled downward, crashing in a heap of twisted metal. Silence. Then the wind reclaimed the night. Kade exhaled slowly, his mind racing. That sound, whatever the cub had done, had disrupted the drone systems. It wasn't coincidence. It was something engineered. The Xyrixians had built these creatures for war, but not just as weapons, as something more. His gut twisted. He needed to move. Pushing forward, he picked up the pace, navigating the ruins with practiced efficiency. The cubs followed without hesitation, their eyes scanning the darkness as if they understood the danger as clearly as he did. An hour passed before he reached his hideout, an old human dropship, half buried in debris, its hull reinforced with scavenged plating. He ducked inside, securing the hatch behind him. The interior was sparse, makeshift bedrolls, a weapons rack, a small terminal linked to a solar charge power cell. It wasn't much, but it was safe. For now. The cubs hesitated at the threshold, uncertain. Kade motioned them inside, and after a beat, they obeyed. The smallest pressed against his leg, its body heat bleeding through his armor. He sighed, rubbing his temple. "What the hell am I supposed to do with you?" he muttered. The cub tilted its head, those eerie silver eyes studying him. It was unsettling. He'd trained elite operatives, fought alongside soldiers who could read body language like a second language. And yet, staring into those eyes, he felt as though the cub understood him in a way no animal should. A quiet beep from his terminal snapped him back to the moment. Kade moved swiftly, fingers dancing across the interface. He had linked into the Xyrixian comms network earlier, piggybacking off their discarded tech. If they were looking for him, he'd know. The screen flickered, then resolved into a live transmission. Unit 47 reporting. Drone destroyed. Energy disruption detected in Quadrant 5. A pause. Then another voice, deeper, authoritative. Confirmed. Deploy ground units. Terminate all organic assets. No survivors. Kade's jaw tightened. They were coming. His hands moved automatically, checking his rifle, securing his gear. His mind raced through options. He could run, but there was nowhere safe. He could fight, but he was one man against an elite kill squad. Then he looked at the cubs. Tiny, defenseless. And yet, the smallest one met his gaze, unblinking. It had done something to that drone. A disruption. A pulse. If that could be controlled, if he could understand it, Then maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. The ship trembled as distant explosions shook the landscape. The Xyrixians were close. Kade exhaled, rolling his shoulders, centering himself. They had come to wipe these creatures out. He wasn't about to let that happen. The night pulsed with distant explosions, the shock waves rolling through the ruined landscape like the heavy exhale of a dying world. Elias Kade crouched in the shadow of his wrecked dropship, rifle braced against his shoulder, his breath slow, controlled. The Xyrixians were closing in. He could hear them now. Sharp, precise footfalls, the mechanical hum of exosuits augmenting their movements. They weren't searching. They knew exactly where he was. The cubs huddled behind him, their small bodies pressed against the cold metal. Even in the dim glow of his visor's HUD, he could see the fear in their movements, the way their ears flattened, the way their muscles tensed like coiled springs. But there was something else, too, a spark beneath the fear, an instinct that hadn't yet found its shape. Kade flexed his grip on his rifle. He had been in worse situations, outnumbered, outgunned, but he had always had a plan. This time, he had 3 half-starved cubs and a malfunctioning bolt-action drone disruptor that barely worked on a good day. A flicker of movement. He fired without hesitation. The first Xyrixian soldier dropped, the round punching clean through the weak point between its armor plates. A split second later, the others opened fire. The air ignited with sizzling plasma bolts, scorching the ship's exterior, sending up showers of molten metal. Kade rolled, keeping low, returning fire in controlled bursts. 1 shot, 1 kill. He took down another before they shifted tactics, flanking him. Too fast, too coordinated. He barely had time to register the shift before a pulse grenade arced toward his position, its dull whine building to a lethal crescendo. He grabbed the smallest cub and dove, shielding it with his body as the explosion tore through his cover, sending debris and shrapnel spiraling into the air. Pain bloomed across his ribs, but he gritted his teeth, shoving himself upright. He had no time to recover. The Xyrixians were advancing, weapons raised, moving with inhuman precision. Then the smallest cub moved. It stepped forward, hackles raised, silver eyes burning with something deeper than fear. A sound rumbled from its throat, not a growl, not a cry, but something impossible to define. The air twisted. A shock wave erupted from the cub, distorting reality itself. The nearest Xyrixian convulsed, its exosuit shorting out in a spray of sparks. The others staggered, weapons flickering offline. For a breathless second, the battlefield froze. Kade didn't hesitate. He shot the closest soldier in the head, then the next. The third tried to retreat, but another pulse from the cub sent it crashing to the ground, body seizing as its own armor turned against it. Silence settled. Smoke curled from the corpses. Kade stared at the cub, chest rising and falling, adrenaline still burning through his veins. It looked back at him, expression unreadable. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was something engineered, something designed. The Xyrixians hadn't abandoned these creatures because they were failures. They had abandoned them because they were terrified of what they could become. More movement. Kade spun, rifle raised, but it was too late. A figure loomed from the darkness, taller than the others, its armor reinforced with layers of alien plating. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and Kade knew, without a doubt, that this was the real threat. A Xyrixian commander. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. The way it moved, the way it assessed the scene, told him everything he needed to know. This one had seen war, had survived it. Kade barely had time to react before it lunged. The force of the impact sent him crashing to the ground, his rifle wrenched from his grip. He rolled, drawing his knife, but the commander was faster, striking with bone-shattering precision. Kade barely managed to deflect the blow, twisting free at the last second. He came up swinging, blade slicing, but the commander caught his wrist, twisting it until something popped. Pain flared, but Kade had no time to register it. The commander threw him to the ground, boot pressing against his chest, pinning him in place. It raised its weapon. Kade braced himself. Then the cubs moved. All three of them. The smallest let out another pulse, but this time it wasn't just a disruption. It was a command. The air vibrated with something raw, something ancient. The other two responded. In perfect synchronization, they attacked. The commander staggered as the first cub struck, its claws raking against its armor with unnatural force. The second went for the joints, biting down with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. And the smallest, the one Kade had carried, unleashed another pulse, direct, focused. The commander's suit locked up. Kade didn't hesitate. He grabbed his knife and drove it upward, straight through the alien's throat. For a moment, it convulsed, its body seizing. Then it fell, crashing lifelessly to the ground. The battlefield fell silent once more. Kade pushed himself up, ribs aching, heart pounding. He looked at the cubs, now standing over the fallen commander, their eyes bright with something he could only describe as understanding. Not just instinct, something more. The Xyrixians had tried to kill them. Now, they would regret failing. The battlefield reeked of charred metal and blood, the cold night thick with the dying embers of combat. Elias Kade stood over the fallen Xyrixian commander, his breath ragged, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. The three cubs pressed close, their small bodies vibrating with something primal, something electric. They weren't trembling from fear anymore. They were waiting, watching, for what came next. Kade wiped the blood from his face, his mind already working through the next move. The Xyrixians wouldn't stop. The loss of a commander didn't mean retreat. It meant escalation. They would send more, bigger, deadlier. And now, they had a target painted on their backs. A sharp chime rang through the wreckage. Kade tensed, eyes locking onto the fallen commander's gauntlet. A soft blue light pulsed from the device embedded in its wrist. A transmission beacon. They knew. He moved fast, tearing the device free, fingers working over the alien interface. If he could hijack the signal, distort it, buy them time, too late. A distant hum split the silence. Low, growing louder. The ground trembled beneath his feet. Dropships. Kade's stomach tightened. No more foot soldiers. No more scouts. This was full extermination protocol. He turned to the cubs. Their silver eyes flickered in the dim light, heads tilted slightly, waiting for his decision, for his command. Something unspoken passed between them. Run? Fight? Neither was good enough. He holstered his rifle, grabbed what little gear he had left, and scooped the smallest cub into his arms. The other two followed as he sprinted toward the wreckage of his own dropship. It was dead metal, powered down for months, but its systems weren't completely fried. If he could force a hard boot, get the engines humming just long enough. The first enemy ship broke through the clouds, sleek and black against the night sky. Its cannons pulsed with lethal intent, locking onto his position. Kade threw himself into the wreckage, the cubs scrambling in behind him. His hands flew over the controls, bypassing fried circuits, rerouting power through whatever was left. Sparks danced across the console as he jammed the last wire into place. The ship groaned, metal shifting, as dying systems blinked to life. Not enough to fly, but enough to send a signal. Kade's fingers danced over the comms, overriding every safety protocol, blasting out an open distress beacon on all frequencies. Not for help, not for reinforcements, for noise, for chaos. The static-laced signal rippled outward, a crude mimicry of the cub's disruption pulse, amplified 100-fold. The approaching Xyrixian ship hesitated midair, its systems flickering as the interference slammed into its core. Warning lights flared across its hull. It fired anyway. Cade grabbed the cubs and dove as the first blast tore through the wreckage, fire licking at his back. Metal screamed, buckling under the impact. The ship shuddered violently, half of it collapsing in on itself. A second shot followed, then a third, and then the sky roared. Not with fire, not with death, with engines. New ships streaked across the sky. Human ships, scavenger class, battle-worn and bristling with weapons. Cade's interference signal had been picked up, and like vultures to a fresh carcass, they had come. Not for him, not for the cubs, but for a fight. The first human vessel opened fire, plasma rounds hammering into the Xyrixian dropship, forcing it into evasive maneuvers. Another ship followed, then another, turning the sky into a brutal dogfight. The Xyrixians, caught between their prey and an unexpected ambush, faltered. Cade didn't waste a moment. He ran, pushing through the burning wreckage, the cubs keeping pace. They moved like shadows now, their steps sure, their purpose aligned with his. He had no plan, no destination, only survival. A ship touched down in the distance, its ramp lowering, human soldiers spilling out, weapons raised. Cade skidded to a stop, chest heaving. The leader stepped forward, helmet tilting as he took in the sight. The lone soldier, the burning wreckage, the three unnatural creatures at his side. No questions, no hesitation. Get in. Cade looked down at the cubs. They weren't just animals. They weren't just abandoned weapons. They were something else, something more. And now they were his. He stepped onto the ship. The ramps sealed shut behind him. The war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But the Xyrixians had made one fatal mistake. They had left their monsters behind. And Cade was about to teach them why that was the worst decision they had ever made.